what is your reaction to Kalen DeBoer being the guy after the guy?
Good luck. It's a tough challenge, but I will say this: it's hard to quibble with a guy that has Kalen DeBoer's track record. I mean, you look at all the success that he's had at multiple levels, but in particular to build this Washington team on the cusp of a national championship. I think they had won 21 straight games, and doing it without the level of talent that an Alabama or Georgia has. They did a really good job of constructing that roster. And look, man, I think there's an idea that just winners win, and Kalen DeBoer seems like one of those guys. So the question I guess I have is he going to recruit at a top 5 level, which is what Alabama's accustomed to? But other than that, he's built a really good organization at Washington. They've developed players. They've retained players with their NIL. He checks every other box that you want to coach and want to check in a coaching search and a coaching hire. So I think it's a pretty good hire for Alabama, and you could certainly do a lot worse than Kalen DeBoer.
Chris, what are your thoughts right out of the gate here?
Yeah, to dovetail off what Sam said, I can't help but think of our roundtable yesterday. Sam and I were the only ones that dropped Kalen DeBoer as a potential who Alabama should hire. So it's a good thing you have us on the podcast. Listen, I'm assuming that a guy like Greg Byrne, who is obviously an SEC guy now, but historically, kind of came up on the West Coast, is not afraid to look outside the box when it comes to potential hires. He knew this day was going to come eventually. So when the list of potential candidates came out of who would replace Nick Saban, I think everybody immediately glommed onto, how big and how long is the Nick Saban tree, and how far can, Greg Byrne go down those branches to see who wants to take over. I assumed that, considering so many of those guys were already in jobs that were really, really attractive, high paying, just attractive jobs on their own, it was going to be hard to get Kirby Smart from Georgia. It was going to be hard to get Steve Sarkisian away from Texas. It was going to be hard to get Dan Lanning away from Oregon. So how would Greg Byrne go about looking at the totality of the search? And the totality of the search was going to take him in places that, frankly, a lot of Alabama fans probably didn't expect if and when the time came that Nick Saban was going to step down. But I agree with Sam. I think this is a very interesting, but also at the same time, I think it's a good hire. I just have a hard time thinking that a guy like Kalen DeBoer, who has earned his stripes, who's coached at the Division III and NAIA levels, has won wherever he's gone. I have a hard time thinking he's going to faceplant. Now, this is the most difficult job in college football, I think you can argue. So there's going to be a learning curve with that, but it depends on how strong of a staff he has and just how well he can recruit coming out of the base.
Yeah, these are all great points, and we will get into them in just a second. But again, let's run through that resume for Kalen DeBoer. Obviously, we just saw him coaching in the national championship game on Monday night. He's 49 years old. He went 25-3 in 2 years at Washington, took over off of a 4-8 season from the previous coaching regime. This was someone who, again, as you mentioned, had success at every single level. He's been the head coach. His overall track record, wins and loss record, is crazy. He won at the NAI level. He won at this level, and he's won at every level in between. Came to Washington from Fresno State, and from there, he was the Indiana offensive coordinator under Tom Allen. So he's had a really interesting trajectory to get to this point. We all joked on Monday that you've got Jim Harbaugh on one sideline, a household name, and then Kalen DeBoer could probably walk into any grocery store in the country and no one would bother him. I think that's going to change now that he is going to be the Alabama head coach, walking into a situation that obviously has a lot of resources and support and insanely high expectations. So we're going to dive into all of this. But before we do, we're going to reflect on how we got here, because it's been a wild 48 hours. But Nick Saban's retirement, it was shocking yet not surprising. At the same time, we all knew that day would come eventually for the 72-year-old head coach. He finally has enlightened us a little bit about the decision. He sat down with Reese Davis of ESPN and talked about why this was the time and really how his age factored into this.
I actually thought that in hiring coaches, recruiting players, my age started to become a little bit of an issue. People wanted assurances that I would be here for 3 years, 5 years, whatever, and it got harder and harder for me to be honest about. And to be honest, this last season was grueling. It was a real grind for us to come from where we started to where we got to. Took a little more out of me than usual, and you know, when people mentioned the health issue, it was really just the grind of, can you do this the way you want to do it? Can you do it the way you've always done it and be able to sustain it and do it for the entire season? And if I couldn't make a commitment to do that in the future, the way I think I have to do it, I thought maybe this was the right time based on those two sets of circumstances.
It's an interesting insight into not wanting to drop off, essentially. Obviously, this Alabama team did make it to the college football playoff, lost in a heartbreaker at the Rose Bowl. But we all talked about it over the course of the season, how it felt like it was one of Nick Saban's best coaching jobs, that he seemed to really enjoy it, taking what that roster looked like in the beginning of the season and ending it with an SEC championship and a college football playoff berth. But these jobs are hard. There are a lot of expectations that come into them. So let's get into why the timing of this made sense for Kalen DeBoer. You are looking at a roster that is going to look vastly different next season for Washington. It's also going to be the first season in the Big Ten. So Chris, let's start with you about the circumstances and why, even though obviously Washington just reached a national championship game, there's a lot of momentum, why this timing made sense for DeBoer to go now.
I just don't think you'll ever get another chance at this job. Like, frankly, I mean, we've talked about not wanting to be the guy after the guy, and a lot of people didn't want to, but I have a hard time believing that turning down this job, I just don't see it coming back to a lot of people. And I especially don't think it would come back to Kalen DeBoer unless he continued to win at Washington and, you know, was contending for national championships. Everything fell into place. The dominoes fell into place. And as you mentioned, the amount of talent that team is losing to the NFL draft this year is going to be pretty drastic. And we see that the roster turnover with these star-studded teams that have made, you know, deep postseason runs, it happens every year. But you combine the reality that you're losing Michael Penix, you're losing Rome Odunze, you're losing Jalen Polk, you're losing Braylon Trice, so on and so forth. You're entering the Big Ten, and let's be honest, the national championship game against Michigan was a little bit, I don't want to say a wake-up call, but kind of a rude introduction into what life will be like. And it didn't go that well for the Huskies. So one interesting kind of dynamic in this whole thing is last year, let's not forget that Nick Saban tried to hire Ryan Grubb, who is, you know, Kalen DeBoer's best friend, his offensive coordinator, kind of his partner in crime, before he settled on Tommy Rees. And now, you know, this like kind of boomerang came back around, and DeBoer is bound for Tuscaloosa, and who knows, maybe Grubb's going to be in the running to replace him. I'm sure we'll get to that point, but this is a job that Kalen DeBoer just frankly couldn't pass down.
Yeah, I
so
think
funny. Sorry, Sam. I just wanted to mention before you jump in, because Sam, you and I saw each other in Houston. There was so much talk about Kalen DeBoer and Michigan because everyone thought the domino of Jim Harbaugh, if he leaves for the NFL, does Michigan go after DeBoer? And I remember talking to someone in the industry who immediately said, well, do you do that, or do you just wait a couple years for when Alabama opens? And then, of course, that happens literally 2 days later, and it creates a different opening and a different job, right? So I think to your point, Chris, about the timing, that like if it works with the guy after the guy, this job doesn't open very often. Nick Saban just had it for 17 years. So I think that is a really important point to underscore, that there's probably very few jobs that Kalen DeBoer would leave Washington coming off an all-time high of playing in a national championship game for.
Yeah, it really is. And like Chris said, it's your stock is never going to get higher than it is right now. And just the future is so uncertain with what the roster holds, what the conference holds, and everything in between. And we don't, the fascinating thing about this to me is we don't know what Kalen DeBoer's dreams are. Like, is this a dream job for him? I would imagine so. But he hasn't coached really anywhere south, in the southern part of the country. He's been, he had Sioux Falls. Obviously, he was in Indiana. He was at Fresno State, now in Washington. But this is a destination job. And I think this is the other fascinating part about it for me is for Washington, which has won a national championship in the past and does think of itself as a power in the sport, a relevant power in the sport. It really kind of gives us a little picture of kind of where they are. Now, I mean, I guess Alabama is one of those just rare jobs that you can leave for, but Washington is a place that you would think that you could hold on to a guy like this. And so all these layers to me are fascinating in this thing. And then the other part of it, you guys mentioned Ryan Grubb earlier, is he the guy that's up next for Washington, or can Kalen DeBoer bring him to Alabama with him? So there's so much to still figure out on this front. But again, a guy with a 104-12 record, man, it's hard to shake a stick at that.